For information, this week we're highlighting the Texas Prosperity Promise. The Texas Prosperity Promise is our pledge to secure and extend Texas' success throughout 2019 and beyond. It's more than a plan for the next legislative session. It's a commitment to guiding values that are critical to keeping Texas prosperous and free. It's a promise to you and a promise for each other to protect and defend the Texas model of liberty and prosperity for years to come. We ask you to join this effort by visiting www.texasprosperitypromise.com and sign the promise to keep fighting for freedom and our shared prosperity. This is also a navigation icon in your app that will direct you to the web page. My name is Talmadge Heflin. I'm the director of the Center for Fiscal Policy, and we are going to talk about the budget this afternoon. We have three very knowledgeable individuals that will be discussing the issue of, what does it take to make a good budget? What do we need to do to have an appropriate state budget? We have with us Representative Drew Springer, a practicing accountant from Munster, Texas. Representative Springer is a lifelong conservative Republican who fights to preserve rural values, promote economic development, and undo burdensome regulations. The bio says fight for rural values, but I think Representative Springer fights for these values whether you're in a city or a rural, statewide. He represents 22 counties in North and West Texas, a member of the Texas House for 3 sessions, now serves as the Vice Chairman of the County Affairs Committee, and also sits on the Redistricting and Ways and Means Committee. Next, we have Bob Williams, President of State Budget Solutions. I feel like Bob ought to be an adopted Texan, but he's all over the country. National expert in fiscal and tax policies, election reform, and disaster preparedness, serves as Senior Fellow with the American Legislative Exchange, founder and Senior Fellow of the Freedom Foundation, the public policy organization in Olympia, Washington, dedicated to advancement of individual liberty. Worked as a GAO auditor of the Pentagon and the Post Office before moving to Washington State, where he served 5 terms in the Washington State Legislature and was the 1988 Republican nominee for governor. The next panelist you've heard from today, but you're going to get more, and he's a wealth of information. Stephen Moore, Distinguished Visiting Fellow for the Project for Economic Growth, the Heritage Foundation, and CNN Senior Economic Analyst. Served as a Senior Economic Advisor to the Donald Trump for President campaign, where he helped write the Trump tax plan and worked on energy and budget issues for candidate Trump. He's currently a member of President Trump's Trump Leadership Council. From 2005 to 2014, served as the Senior Economics Writer for the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and is a member of the journal's editorial board from 1999 to 2004, served as founder and president of the Club for Growth, a 25,000-member organization dedicated to helping elect free market tax-cutting candidates in Congress. With that, I'll call on Representative Springer to come and share some comments with us.
All righty. Hi, I'm Drew Springer, House District 68. As Talmadge said, I'm the bookend of the Texas legislature. You have Harris County that has 25 state representatives. I have 22 counties. I have a whole lot more cows than they do, though. Just a couple slides, I want to give you just sort of a quick overview on some information for those who may not be familiar with the Texas budget. So out of our $217 billion biennial budget, this has 2018 and 19, what we're looking at here in education is an interesting one because education and healthcare makes up over 80% of the Texas budget. Education has not doubled quite since 2000, but if you look at healthcare, it's almost gone up 3x. And I think anybody who has insurance deductibles and premiums, and everybody realizes that this is one of the challenges that we face as a state, is how do we control that? How do we do our best job to be able to manage that? One of the other challenges I think that is facing all states is what is going on in the world of sales tax. I like to tell everybody we have 28 million tax cheats in the state of Texas, and that's because anything we buy online that doesn't charge sales tax, we are legally responsible for paying that. And so a show of hands, if Glenn Hager was here, he would be the only one raising his hand saying, I pay what I owe. Nobody else knows how to do that. That's going to be one of our big challenges. Now, I've been with NCSL and ALEC and talking about task force, and one of the issues that we talk about is different in Texas is we say we would like to be able to collect that sales tax so we can lower our property taxes, whereas other states say we want to collect that tax, that additional sales tax, so they can spend it. So we see that as really how we lower our property taxes, how we can get that. Steve said in his keynote speech in there, we're number 4. That would help us get and start moving to be number 3 or number 2. And that's on top of my bill that I'll be working on here in the interim that, we're going to try to figure out how we can reduce, not just have reform that the governor talks about, but actually reduce the M&O property taxes that is charged to our local taxpayers. One of the big arguments that we have is that the state is paying less and less of a percentage of our schools' cost, and it's passed to the locals. We've used that savings that the state hasn't been putting in to do health care, but we need to get closer to that 50-50 and reduce that property tax burden. And so look forward to the rest of the questions and discussing more on it. Let's see. That's all I had. Oop. Yep, there was my school one. I'm sorry. So for those who are wondering, what does that 50% look for? In 2008, we were about even, the blue line being the state. We have increased our spending, so anybody who says we don't spend as much as we used to is not telling the full story. We don't spend as big a percentage as we used to. So the state has benefited from that tax savings while we continue to spend more and more on public education. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. Bob?
It's great being here again today. As Talmadge mentioned, I used to be an auditor for the Government Accountability Office in Washington, D.C. Minor assignments, the Post Office and the Pentagon. But nothing in that experience auditing the Pentagon prepared me for the state of Washington when I was a state legislator and the lack of fiscal accountability. It was just unbelievable. Well, GAO has a report out. It says closing the fiscal gap in state and local government sector would require action to be taken today and maintained every year until 2065, equivalent either to a 5% reduction in current expenditures or a 5% increase in tax, or a combination. You think you have a problem? It's coming. ALEC strongly recommends that state legislators take action this year to resolve their serious financial crisis by changing, in other words, eliminating the current budget system and go from an input system to an outcome system. In other words, they should junk their conventional budget system and start designing budgets from the ground up based upon priorities and outcome performance measures. It's a radical concept. I know Talmadge has been pushing this for years, but it's really true. Budgets drive all policy, which is why debating, writing, and approving a state budget is the primary task legislators must accomplish. Governors and state agencies cannot spend even $1 without the approval of the legislature. So legislators, you're in control. You have the responsibility and the authority to take care of it. But unfortunately, in most states, state legislators start the process by focusing entirely on inputs. How much needs to be put in to sustain current programs and expenses? They take existing programs, adjust for inflation, some new programs, caseload increases, add a few other initiatives, and they call that their baseline budgeting. So if the baseline budgeting was $200 billion for the state, and the inflation increase, et cetera, was 20 billion, and they gave 220 billion as the new baseline budget, but the legislature only approved 210 billion, that would be considered by the media and by the legislators as a $10 billion cut. It's an increase. I call that iceberg budgeting, or maybe cost plus. The problems get worse when the typical budget focuses on program intentions, not on actual results. When most of the attention is focused on who spends the money, not who benefits. The problems get worse when the budget typical goes from program intentions with results and most of the attention is focused on who does spend the money. Legislators use this conventional budget approach and they blame enablers for agencies and programs that are likely outdated or fundamentally flawed. But they don't hold hearings on it. What a radical concept. Imagine changing the current budget and going to an outcome performance-based system. What happens in a performance-based system? For example, your governor would identify his 5 to 10 core functions of government. Every single program would have to meet a core function of government or it would be eliminated. That's a good way to get rid of it. If the agencies do not already have mission statements, the governor would mandate that every agency must have a mission statement with outcome measures. The governor then should appoint an advisory team that should include some representatives from state legislators, state employees, and agency directors. Now, to kind of guide them, the governor should appoint a guidance team for each core function. It should consist of about 10 state and local government, business, and nonprofit executives. This group is not intended to represent a specific interest, like labor, or subject matter. Their role is to, 1, provide an executive perspective and develop recommendations on the statewide vision that will maximize the results to the citizen. 2, bring an outside perspective to what is historically an insider's game. 3, review and strengthen and affirm the work presented by the advisory team. The next step would be for the governor to appoint a multi-agency results team representing each of the governor's core functions, plus a team of state employees and teacher personnel, which would look at the salary, healthcare, retiree benefits, and pensions. The team should have free rein to meet the core functions. Each team would be composed of 6 to 8 subject matters experts from the governor's branch with knowledge and appreciation for the implementation, but they still should have the ability to recommend significant changes in the system. Now, the recommendation should consider how will the state measure its progress on an outcome performance basis in looking at the programs. What will success look like? What measurement outcomes can be identified? What is the most effective way to accomplish the state goals with the money available? If a service or program is a core function of government, what level of government should provide it? How can services be provided efficiently and effectively? How can market forces and competition be introduced into the core functions? What programs and services will make the most difference? What can we consolidate? What programs and services aren't making as much of a difference? What criteria can guide us in assessing the value and determine who should be funded? What are the key indicators and what do they tell us? Well, if that's not a radical concept, let me go over 2 things. 1, I recommend that the legislature toss the current budget process and go to an outcome performance measure system. 2, this is different. I recommend that every state legislator get involved in the budget process. If factually the budget determines what agencies and the governor can spend, every legislator should be involved in it, whether on a subcommittee, on their standing committees, or whatever, to make sure they have input into the process. In too many states, and I'm not saying Texas, in too many states, the budget is decided by 2 people, the House Budget Chair, the Senate Budget Chair, and the rest of the members of the Ways and Means Committee or Appropriations Committee are left out of the process. Well, let me give you an example. In Washington State, we did this in 1982. The state had a $2.4 billion budget deficit, which grew to a $2.8 billion before they passed the budget. And so they worked together and they came up with 10 core functions of government. Now, as a conservative, I probably would have 6 or 7. But we had a Democrat governor, a Democrat House, and a Republican-controlled Senate by 1 vote. So the core functions were: 1, improve student achievement in elementary, middle, and high schools. 2, improve the value of post-secondary learning. 3, improve the health of Washingtonians. 4, improve the security of Washington's vulnerable children and adults. 5, improve the economic vitality of business and individuals. 6, improve the statewide mobility of people, goods, and services. 7, improve the safety of people and property. 8, improve the quality of Washington natural resources. 9, improve the cultural and recreation opportunities throughout the state. And 10, strengthen the governor's ability to achieve results efficiently and effectively. Now, this blew me away because I was not in the legislature then, but I was working with them. The state agency personnel adapted to this immediately. As soon as they found their 10 core functions of government, they worked together. And each of the 10 core functions were given a budget. First, 5% was put into reserve in case of emergency. The other 95% was allocated among the agencies. Surprisingly, 9 of the 10 core function work teams were able to develop a budget that prioritized their spending into high, medium, and low within their budget. Only one couldn't. You probably can guess who that was. K-12. K-12 came back and said, we need more money. And so people said, well, what will you give us? And they, well, we don't want to give you anything. We just need more money. So higher ed said, we will give you $400 million if you provide a better qualified student to our colleges. K-12 said, okay. They signed the agreement. They never completed the agreement. Higher ed will never do that again. It was a big factor in terms of that. But the interesting thing was the discussion that went on. After the legislature approved the budget, $2.84 billion, the governor came back and said, I appreciate everything you've done, but I want to give a salary increase to state employees. They said, we can't do that, Governor, there's no money. So after negotiation, they gave the state employees a salary increase in the first year and cut some of the other programs to make up for the money. But it really works in terms of doing that. You have a problem in this state with your budget. What's the budget going to be in January of 2019? It's going to be a hole. And part of the hole is caused by the practice of taking money from dedicated funds and using it to balance the budget so you don't raise taxes. Part of the problem is delaying appropriations to agencies for the second year of their biennium until next year. And part of the problem is some of the other games that are played. I guarantee you, if you go to performance-based outcome budgeting, you take 5% off the top, prioritize it, look at outcomes, you're going to have a major difference. TPPF has done a major job. Talmadge can help you. Education's done a good job on K-12. They have a pamphlet out in the hall. Higher ed has done a good job on that in terms of where savings are. But let me tell you, once you start looking at how programs are delivered, you look at outcomes, you'll find major savings.
Thank you, Bob. Steve?
Good to see you, Steve.
Hi, everybody. Just a couple of quick points that I think are important about the state budget. Now, how many of you in this room work in some capacity for the state legislature? I think many of you do. So I want to talk just for a couple minutes about the big change that happened in the tax law that is going to have an unbelievably big impact on state and local government. Less so in Texas, more so obviously in the higher tax blue states, but it's going to affect Texas too. And I want to talk a little bit about this cap on the state and local tax deduction. It's a big deal, and I think most state lawmakers have not even started to think about how big this is. So let me talk about how things worked before we changed this law and how they work now. I was one of the biggest proponents, advocates of getting rid of the state and local tax deduction. We didn't get rid of it, we capped it at $10,000. It is no fair and it's not good government for people in Texas to have to pay for government services in New York and Massachusetts and so on. So no longer are states going to be able to allow their taxpayers to essentially write off as much as 40% of their state taxes. That is true, obviously in really high tax states like New York and Connecticut and Illinois, but it also affects your state as well. You mentioned the property taxes, which is, I think, the one big problem you have. At least when I talk to my friends in Texas, the thing they complain about is property taxes. You're in great state because you have no income tax. Incidentally, I just did a study with my friend Art Laffer. We are estimating that if New York, California, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, and Minnesota don't change their tax system right away, that they are going to lose combined about 1 million people to low tax states. A lot of them are coming, for better or worse, to Texas. And they're coming to Texas, they're coming to Florida, they're coming to Nevada, they're coming to Utah, they're leaving the high tax states and they're coming to the low tax states at even larger numbers than they have. Now, what does this mean for Texas? You're a high property tax state. There are a lot of people that I talk to in Texas, I don't live here, who tell me that they pay more than $10,000 a year in property taxes. And that means that at the margin, they are going to have to pay the full freight. And essentially what this really means is that for the last 50 years, you've been able to charge your taxpayers here in Texas you're able to spend $1 on government services, but you're forced to charge your taxpayers 75 or 80 cents on the dollar because the other 15, 20, 25 cents is picked up by the federal government. The jig is up on that. Now when you have $1 of government services, whether it's for your schools or your roads or your social programs, the dollar has to come from people who live in Texas. It's not coming from people in other states. That's a game changer. That's a game changer. It means every state is going to have to get a lot more efficient quickly about how you provide value for your services, because if you don't, you're going to have people with pitchforks marching on the state capitol demanding relief. And so it's something you all have to think about. How are we going to reduce the cost of government services so you're providing people with the dollar benefit for the dollar that they are paying in taxes? Again, because you have no income tax, you're not going to face nearly as tough a time as those northeastern states, but it will affect the state of Texas as well. That's point number one. Point number two, the reason that so many states have been in financial trouble over the last few years has not really been overspending by states. I mean, there have been in periods when states overspend, but the truth is the major reason, and you were talking about the fact that you have some challenges here in Texas in terms of paying your bills. And the major factor for that is the last 10 years have been lousy for the U.S. economy. We've been underperforming economically. We've been growing at less than 2% per year. And when the U.S. economy underperforms, one of the victims of that is states, because when less people are working, people are making less money, corporations are making less money, that's less money that states have. And so revenues have not been flowing into states at the rate that they normally do because the economy has stunk for the last 10 years. This is where I'm optimistic. I do think we've ratcheted up growth from 2%, less than 2%. In fact, in Obama's last year in office, we had 1.6% growth, which is really pathetic. We're up to 3%, and I'm hoping we can get, on a sustainable 3% basis. That's going to help states. They're going to get more revenues. One other quick point about this: the biggest beneficiaries of the tax cut are states and localities, because what this means is over the next decade, $1.5 trillion, which would leave states and go to Washington, no longer leave. It stays in Texas, or it stays in Kansas, or it stays in Massachusetts. So that means you're not sending as much to Washington. That benefits you all at the state level. Final point I want to make, just in terms of how you can, and this is just something I feel so passionately about. It's true in every state. I don't know if it's so true in Texas. Higher education. Moore's kind of rule of thumb is every state university in the country is spending about twice what they should. That is, tuition at most universities should be half of what it is. The biggest financial scam in America is how much universities are charging our families. There's just no question about it. And what would be a very useful thing is, and I think you've started to do this in Texas, and the people who run the universities will resist this to the hilt. The last thing they want you to do is look under the hood and see how they are spending that money you're sending them. So I would love to see, you all sponsor an independent audit of every single university, Texas A&M, Texas, all of the public universities in the state, and see how they're spending their money, and come back and say, how can they cut their spending in ways that will freeze tuition for the next 5 years in this state? I mean, wouldn't that be a wonderful initiative for the families of Texas? So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know how many of you are in the pitchfork business, but if everybody marches on the Capitol in Austin with their pitchfork, somebody's got to sell a lot of pitchforks. but at any rate, you have on the table before you a one-sheet handout that says 2018-19 supplemental appropriations limits. For the last 2 sessions, we've been advocating that the budget grow no more than by population plus inflation. In 2015, a budget was written that stayed below a 6.5% population plus inflation amount. In 2017, we projected the number, and we've used the most recent 2 years rather than just totally projecting what the next 2 years would be, but we projected that would be a 4.5%. Now, we have the General Appropriations Act that's passed during the session, and in the next session, when the legislature comes to town, they have another appropriation bill for that same period of time, same 2-year period of time, to get the things that they may have overlooked, whether intentional or non-intentional, to finish out the 2-year period. We call that the supplemental appropriation bill. So the General Appropriations Act plus the supplemental for 2015 legislative session stayed under the 6.5%. To stay under the 4.5%, they would have, for state funds, $1.92 billion available before they hit the cap. And for all funds, which include federal funds, it's $2.79 billion. Now, you might say, well, what about things such as the Harvey rebuilding? We believe that if you are rebuilding the infrastructure with state money that was caused by the flooding of Hurricane Harvey, we believe that should not be counted. But as states' government tends to do, they tend to try to pull other things into that. So we'll be watching that very closely and not counting that against that 4.5%, but if they go over it, it will be counted. So we're looking forward to the legislature staying within the 4.5% when they come back to town in 2019. And that's one of the things that we need to watch very closely. A couple of points, a few points. I think the thing that we need to remember, and we're talking about Texas and the state budget, but the budget is spending, not revenue. You might say, well, that's obvious, but legislators many times will take a look at how much revenue they have available, and they'll go about appropriating that amount rather than looking at what the real needs are. And that's what we need to look at, is the needs and not the wants. And we need to look at things like zero-based budgeting. In other words, rather than starting with the previous budget, look at what is really needed, as if the government had no money to start with, and they don't, it's all your money, and then build a budget from there and look at it on a program-by-program basis. Representative Springer, how do you think that would work with the Texas legislature if we went to a zero-based budgeting process?
You know, we have proposed that over the last few sessions of doing that. Obviously, state is big as Texas, and especially because we want to be involved as legislators, it would be somewhat of a difficult task. But I think at a bare minimum, you need to start rotating it. It needs to be part of the sunset process, and potentially double that instead of every 12 years, every 6 years. At least every agency is looked at from ground zero and built back up to be able to do that. So we do it to some extent through sunset today, but not as much as we should.
Bob, have you, in your experience with budget writing over the country, have you seen any state that effectively uses a zero-based process to build their budget?
Not exactly zero-based, but performance-based. Utah's used it. Washington State used it, but then when the revenue got better, they dropped it. North Carolina's used part of it. Surprisingly, Mississippi right now is using it.
Steve, have you observed, as you've been involved in different organizations, have you observed any states that really have used a zero-based approach?
You know, I haven't. I would really defer to Bob on this because you follow this stuff much more closely than I have. But, you know, the main thing that I've seen that has worked for states in terms of controlling their expenditures, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, Bob, is the constitutional limitations on spending. And which state is it that was really kind of made famous for the taper? That was Colorado, right?
Colorado
first did that. And, you know, you have to have it in the Constitution. If it's just legislative caps, you know, they will evade those caps. But those work pretty well. I mean, we looked at, you know, what works in controlling expenditures over time and what doesn't. And there's little question that if you have a hard cap, you know, I think that was tied to what, population growth plus inflation. Now, you may have that in Texas already. I don't know if you have that kind of thing.
Our cap is a little bit different from
Right.
that. We
How's it?
proposed to lower it to population inflation.
What's yours?
Ours
Personal income?
basically gives about 2 to 3% more over what population inflation is.
Well,
you
we
can't-
have,
that's, by the way, that's unsustainable.
Yeah,
You know, you can't have expenditures keeping going up. But,
And I will
you know,
say this, in the last 2 sessions, we have been below population and inflation in both the ones, and I think, you know, as conservative members, that's what we keep pushing for. In fact, in the 83rd, I didn't think we were there. It was my first session, and I voted against the budget because of it.
yeah, Bob?
Talmadge, your state has become a leader through TPPF on right on crime, and it's being implemented all over the country. Well, there's other things you could learn from other states. Medicaid, you could learn that from Florida. What Florida's done on Medicaid is amazing. K-12 education,
what have they done on Medicaid?
they have, I can't remember the group down there. They've been able to come up with getting a waiver from the feds. Oh,
Yeah.
let me talk louder.
Right.
Getting a waiver from the federal government and running,
They're basically running their own program, right?
they're
And
running their own program,
they
but having
have a
a
cap
help,
on how much they can
hand
spend.
up, and not penalizing people. K-12 is a mess around the country. And again, TPPF has a study out there. If you simply look at how much increase K-12 teachers have had, and then make sure it's the K-12 teacher in the classroom rather than the other K-12 teachers that are 10 to 20% more, the administrators, and then the other K-12, you'll find the K-12 teachers have the smallest increase in terms of that. But as was mentioned at lunch, I think, Demin, I think, mentioned it, coming up with a voucher program or things that would really help. Higher ed is a mess around the country. My radical solution is I don't think the state should fund any college or university in their state. Instead, they should give the students a voucher. Because the universities, as you mentioned earlier, are just spending money without regard to student performance. They don't care if a kid graduates. In Washington State, 2 of our four-year schools, after 6 years, these are four-year schools, after 6 years, less than 50% of kids get a degree. But they don't care because the state keeps giving them the money based on how many kids they have.
So on this Medicaid issue, I want to touch on what you just said, because there's a fairly famous example of what you're talking about. I met the Medicaid director of all states, Rhode Island, which is Rhode Island's one of the bluest of blue states, one of the most liberal states in the country. And yet, this is a story that's not well known, but literally in the last days of the George W. Bush administration, Rhode Island got one of these waivers that you're talking about that Florida got. And it basically did what we want to do for all states, which is cap how much we give you in Medicaid. So in Texas, we'd look at what's your poor population, what's your overall population, what are your costs, and we give you X amount of dollars. And we basically say you've got to meet certain, you got to give coverage to people and so on and so forth, but you run your program yourself. Well, they did this in Rhode Island, and it was an astounding success. They reduced their spending rate. We actually went negative for a few years when they were able to put in their own reforms that were not permissible when the federal government was running it. So let me just give you a couple examples. One of the things they did was they said if a Medicaid patient goes to the emergency room, because as you know, a lot of Medicaid patients use the emergency room for their health care, they would charge a $20 copayment. So you have to pay $20 to use the emergency room. By just doing that, they reduced their emergency room visits by 40%.
Wow.
Exactly
40%. Just requiring somebody to pay something because it wasn't free to them anymore. Another example, you could do this in Texas very easily. Medicaid, as many of you know, at least you know these numbers better than I do, probably half your cost is on nursing home and elder care, right? Well, nursing home care is expensive. It's really expensive to put a senior in nursing homes, and a lot of them don't have to be in a nursing home. And so what they allowed in Rhode Island was for home care, and they would provide the family with some funding to provide the care for their elderly parents. It saved a lot of money, and B, the seniors preferred being in the home rather than being in the nursing home. So there are hundreds of kinds of examples of that where you and all in Texas, I was telling Brooke this earlier, if you had that kind of thing, I'll bet you all here in Austin could cut your costs by 20% without diminishing at all.
No, absolutely. I've talked to
care.
Congressman Burgess about that. Michael will go, be careful what you ask for, but for the very point, I said, we will actually probably cover more people, but there will be some constraints on there in how you run through that process.
What did he say to that?
He said, I want you to have it,
right.
But he goes, but be careful what you ask for, because then you can't point at me anymore. And I said,
right.
We'll be the grown-ups.
Yeah, you'll have to be accountable for how you spend
and
money.
that's fine. I'm accountable. I see my 160,000 people just like Doc and Dennis does, when we're traveling our districts. And so, that's a piece. We did it to your relative side. We did that with foster care this year, where we know that it's cheaper to give a little bit for kinder care, i.e. a grandparent or an aunt and uncle that has to feed a kid that it can eat $600 worth of groceries a month, just a little bit of money to help them there versus paying a foster care family to be able to do that. So we have looked at those solutions and how we
You could not come up, I said this earlier this morning at one of the sessions, some of you may have been in it, you truly couldn't come up with a dumber system than Medicaid. Really. If we sat here and tried to think, how can we make the dumbass Medicaid system is the worst system possible, we would come up with what they have right now. And what we are doing now, you know this, Bob, under Obamacare, because by the way, Obamacare was nothing more than just a massive expansion of Medicaid. That's how they got all these people, they said they were going to change the whole insurance system. That didn't happen. They just put all the uninsured in Medicaid, which is the worst. By the way, the quality of care in Medicaid is terrible too. In a lot of states, putting someone on Medicaid doesn't improve their health status versus not having insurance at all. In any case, what we done under Obamacare was we basically provided a state like Texas, all the states, a 90% match. So for every dollar that you spend in Texas, the federal government gives you 90 cents. Your incentive in the states is actually to spend more money on Medicaid because look, if we had a deal where you, sir, gave me, for every dollar I spent 90 cents, I would spend money through the wahoo. I'd go out for dinner every night and have lobster and caviar, right? Economics is about incentives, and we've got the incentives all wrong on Medicaid. So what we're saying under this new regime that we're talking about, now when you spend a dollar,
it comes from, you only get $1, you don't get anything more, and that changes everything.
Well, like I said, it's our fastest growing percentage.
Right.
It is why it is, takes more away from what we can spend on roads or in
Yep,
K through
yep,
12 education. Another challenge we had this last budget year, and we're going to have it again this next time, is on our retired teachers' health care. It's not a pension type of system that's accrued. It's a pay-as-you-go system that we're working in there. I mean, but we've got, once again, federal government. We need we may try an innovative way. I know there's a representative that's heard who's proposed, because 51% of the healthcare costs for our retired teachers is pharmaceuticals. And he's proposing to say, they let Colorado smoke dope. Why don't we let our retired teachers buy prescriptions from across the border at a 50% savings? And, right there alone, we solve that issue if we were able to do that.
So is Texas on this Medicaid thing, because I think it's so important, it is a driver of state budgets. I mean, why hasn't Texas, maybe you have.
We have asked for grants.
You've
We've
asked
asked
for
to
a
have it
waiver?
block granted back. Wait.
Oh, you mean your own waiver with
Yes.
the Trump, do you know where that stands?
I do not know where that
Yeah.
stands.
I mean, we should drive that, why, because what happens, sorry to go off on this, but I know the swamp. I live in the swamp, right? And what happens is, this happened under the Bush administration, a little less so under Obama, but still, the career people who run the Medicaid program, they don't want to give you guys control, because why would they have to have jobs, right? I mean, so their incentive is to not give you control, and it's only going to happen if you push and push and push and push and bring it up to the highest level, where they've said, well, yeah, why wouldn't we give Texas or Florida or another state that kind of waiver? That's the way, Florida got it, is Rick Scott just would not take no for an answer, and then we're going to need that from Texas.
Let me address one thing Bob's comment he made on the dedicated funds and using it to balance our budget. I will say this, one of the things we've done all 3 sessions I've been in is we have reduced those dedicated funds. So we have not relied on taking new tax dollars and not spending them to balance the budget. So we are in the process of reducing those and clearing those out. So we're heading in the right direction. We haven't cleared them completely, but we'll continue to do so.
One of the things, the foundation is close to releasing a report that addresses what we would do if the feds gave us a real waiver for Medicaid and let us run the program just like we feel like it should be made. And that report will be coming out within the next few weeks. I wanted to clarify one thing. The spending limit that the state currently has in the Constitution, it says that the growth in appropriations shall grow no faster than the growth of the economy in the state.
Income, basically.
That's in the Constitution. General law says the growth of the economy will be measured by the projected growth in personal income. And so sometime in October or November, prior to the session starting, a group of economists, usually get about 4 or 5, will give their opinion of what the projected growth in personal income is for the next 2 years, which really is about the next 2.5 years. And that's generally anywhere from 9 to 12%. Now, state conservative legislators plus conservative groups around the state have been encouraging the legislature to grow, to adopt population plus inflation. So the last 2 sessions, they've adopted that. Now, the growth in personal income, and that's, it also says that will apply only to funds, general revenue, not dedicated by the Constitution, which is only about 45% of the budget. And so we're advocating that all of the budget would come under that population plus inflation, even federal funds. It was mentioned earlier that agencies can't spend money unless it's appropriated. And that applies to federal funds alike. The legislature has to appropriate the federal funds before agencies can spend it. So that is a falsehood when legislators say, well, we can't control the federal funds. Yes, you can. You have to appropriate the money. And so that's something that needs to be always included in the growth
Talmadge,
as well. Yes.
how do you stop the legislature from gaming the system? I know this happens in almost every state, but for example, last year, they delayed payment to state highway fund for the next 2-year budget. It's about $1.6 billion they have to make up. The Texas Tomorrow Fund stopped accepting applications, but it has a $240 million budget shortfall. And there's examples like that where they game the system.
Well, in the numbers that I gave that you have on your sheet includes that repaying that shortfall where they shorted the highway fund. That's included in there. But that's what the supplemental appropriation is all about, is when they come to town to finish out the 2-year period, they have to appropriate what's needed for that. They typically will underfund Medicaid because, and one of the reasons for that is that the agency sets the rates, the reimbursement rates. So if the legislature were to appropriate more money than they project is needed, then they may raise the rates and kind of blow the budget there. So they typically will underfund that by a small amount. There have been times when it's been underfunded by maybe by a quarter, which is a misuse of that process. So,
I think we're about $1 billion short for Medicaid coming into is the rough number. And Bob, I agree with you. I think it's an accounting trick. When I ran the first time, I ran against that because they had done it with the school fund. I will say this, the House did not agree with doing that process, but the budget was written in the Senate side and they overruled
I ran
us.
against it the 10 years I was in the legislature and I never won.
Well, we've come to the time for the Q&A from the audience. We've got a mic around here somewhere. Where's my, here we are. I would ask you to wait until the mic gets to you when you're called on, and please be succinct with your question. We don't have a lot of time left, and so we rather than making a statement, please ask a very succinct question. Does anybody have a question of the panel? Right down here.
Stephen, you mentioned about Florida getting the Medicaid waiver. How many states have been able to get waivers from the feds on
That's
on
a good
Medicare?
question. I don't know the answer to that. Florida, we mentioned two, Florida and Rhode Island. Bob, do you know?
There's quite a few more, I don't know.
But it depends a lot on what the waiver allows you to do, right? I mean, you can get waivers for kind of minor things, but what I'm talking about is a global waiver where you take control of running your Medicaid program, and you totally change the incentive structure. Because what's happening now is Medicaid is not just bankrupting the federal government. It's as you talked about in your presentation, both sides have more and more incentives to just spending more and more money.
No, it's exactly right.
So, I've been urging the White House just, when a state makes a waiver, why not? Why not allow that? We believe in federalism. Why not allow a state to experiment? Maybe the experimental. I mean, that's what federalism is about. And by the way, it doesn't make sure that it doesn't guarantee that the program the state puts in effect will work. But this is, by the way, I'm sorry to go off on this, but welfare reform was one of the great public success stories of the last 50 years. And how welfare reform happened, you lived through this too, Bob, was we had governors like Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin and John Engler of Michigan and Fife Symington of Arizona. I'm dating myself in mentioning these names. But, and they started putting in place through waivers work requirements, term limits. I mean, not term limits. I'm in favor of term limits, but time limits on how long you can get the benefits. A study program, so these welfare recipients could be trained for jobs, and it was a spectacular success. I mean, a spectacular success, and it didn't come from the federal government. It came to the states. And if we're ever going to change Medicaid, it ain't coming from the federal government. It ain't coming from Washington. It's coming from Washington. It's coming from the state capitals around the country.
But and we have to hold myself and our bodies responsible because
and that's why a lot of people don't want it. I
filed a bill last session that I couldn't get a hearing for to make SNAP recipients that were single able-bodied. I mean, no kids, no disability, have a 20-hour work requirement and couldn't get a hearing.
You couldn't what?
Couldn't get a hearing for it.
That's really.
Yeah, I guarantee it'll be filed again this time.
Because
so.
there are 4 or 5 states that have done, have
Oh, I
started
know,
to implement those.
and the results are phenomenal. If you
Yeah.
look at Kansas and Maine, and you're right, because that's why this process works so well is, I know I never come up with the best ideas. I steal the best ideas. And that is what makes me a great legislator.
That's what, it makes you smart if you're stealing good ideas.
That's
I
the
believe
way
we
to
had
go.
a question over here. Did I see a hand earlier right here?
Thank you. Representative Springer, as a representative representing rural communities, how do you see that they are represented? Where do they fit in this modern urban Texas economy?
You know, their big challenges is, you know, if you talk to most folks up there, they lift themselves up by the bootstraps. They say, just leave us alone, don't pass any more regulations, just keep Austin and Washington out of our business and let things go. Realize that the challenges of smaller class sizes with rural education is an issue, and they say, don't leave us behind. You spend $40 million for Toyota to come here, and I think that is a good return on our investment. But at the same time, we need broadband so our kids that are out in rural Texas can do online education. They can do some of the dual credits. They can do some of those other things. So they're saying, we need a little bit, but we're not asking for a whole lot. And so that's it. You know, the other piece that's sort of outside of TPPFs is, you know, Christian conservative values, and they want you to fight for those and maintain those.
Other questions? I have one back here.
I'm intrigued by the independent audit y'all suggested of universities and for vouchers as well. But the main argument I have found pushing back against any type of budgetary reform is that it would reduce the competitiveness of the university. Do y'all know of any examples where these types of reforms have been implemented and the university would still be able to maintain its competitiveness?
Go ahead, Bob.
Purdue University, Mitch Daniels, when he took over,
That's a good one.
the tuition's not being raised.
Yep.
Once you
In
come
about,
in,
what, 4 or 5 years or something?
yeah,
Yeah.
tuition's the same. And
Purdue,
he's,
yep.
Purdue, and he's really working on getting better quality faculty.
Just a little, I got to just tell you the story. I mean, about 2 years ago, I was invited to speak at this university that I didn't want to go to, you know, but they kept pestering me and I agreed to go. And it's called the College of the Ozarks. And I don't know if anyone in this room has heard of that school. I had never even heard of it before I went out there, but it's in the Ozark Mountains. Most of the students there are first-generation college students. They've never, you know, it's a fairly agricultural and a lower income area. And anybody want to take a guess at what the tuition is there? 0. You know what? How they get away with that? The students work for their tuition. They work for their education. So every student works 15 to 20 hours a week, and at the university, whether it's doing janitorial work or working in the laboratories or you know, whatever it is, in an electric power plant and so on. And what an idea. What a great idea. Students who are 20, 21, and 22-year-old actually having to work for their tuition. I mean, you want to get rid of all this liberal nonsense at universities, make students start to have to work for their tuition, and then they'll start to demand classes that actually provide them. And by the way, I never met more impressive students in my life, and I've spoken at Harvard, Yale, Northwestern, Duke, than these kids at College of the Ozarks. Because you have to work for something you value it.
That's right.
Other questions? One back over here.
Representative Springer, you spoke about the difficulty in collecting sales taxes given the online economy.
Right.
What about gasoline taxes? A whole lot of people are driving Teslas and other electric cars, and basically gasoline taxes, which pay for a lot of the road improvements, are also, I would assume, hard to collect. Are there any thoughts that any of the legislators are having about other ways of finding those funds?
Yeah, I mean, there is, and I spoke briefly at the start when I'm saying, hey, we ought to look at reducing property taxes, and one of those is how do you collect the taxes on vehicles that utilize the road to be able to reduce traffic jams. I live in the country, so I'm thinking about maintenance, but you know, and do it from that standpoint, and then use the savings from that to be able to buy down property taxes. Texas is 46th in the nation overall in taxes. We just collect a huge amount from property taxes. But if you redid that, I think you would sit here and say, okay, look, we've got to look at it and says, what does the average car that drives 18,000, if that's the average, use in gas taxes? And if they pay that, then electric cars, their registration fee may have to reflect that to be able to pay for the roads they drive on. And I think that's fair. And I think if you look at it from the standpoint it says you should have a very wide pool that is very shallow, that everybody pays their fair share, then it's hard to argue that that's picking on one group versus another.
We're coming to a close in time. The title of the panel was How Should Legislators Set Priorities in the Texas Budget? As you come up with different ideas about how you think they might be able to do that, share that with your state representative and your senator and encourage them to be involved, whether they're on Senate Finance or House Appropriations. Encourage them to be involved in the budget. I want to remind you that those that will benefit from the continuing education credits from the state bar, remember to sign the sheet in the back so you'll get credit for that. We appreciate the fact that you're here today. We ask that you give our panel a round of applause and thanks for them today. We look forward to seeing you in other panels as we continue to the next 2 days. Thank you very much.